Hi all, I'm back with part B of environmental health, and we left off, we were talking about pathogens, and we talked about CRISPR-Cas9 and the usefulness of that gene editing tool and potentially eradicating malaria from the world. Now, we might be a few years out. I think we could probably do it today if we wanted to push it. We already have mosquitoes that have been created in a lab that cannot harbor the protozoan malaria. So Plasmodium, it doesn't have the ability to, the mosquito doesn't have the ability to foster Plasmodium any longer. And so we do probably have the tools to get rid of it. It's just the political and sociological and economical point of view that we haven't really considered and haven't worked out all the bugs with. Okay, so moving from there though, we can start talking about some other things that are going on, like emergent diseases. These are diseases that either have not been previously known or have been absent for a long period of time. So bird flu, that's popped up occasionally in the 2000s in different places. Ebola, most recently, within the last 5 years, has come about, even a couple cases in the United States. And then HIV, which we knew about HIV prior to the 80s, but really became rampant in the 80s and the 90s. And all these would be considered emergent diseases. And so how do we approach them? What do we do about them? In some cases, like Ebola, it was a race to see if we could develop a vaccination. HIV, we still are trying to develop a vaccination for it. Now, a couple years ago, an individual won the Nobel Prize for research on HIV and creating a drug that doesn't allow someone who has HIV to pass that virus on. So ultimately, if every single person in the world took this drug who had HIV, you could pretty much eradicate it from the human population because there'd be no way to pass it on. But that'd be very, very expensive and not likely to ever happen. So there are still individuals that are working on, vaccinations for HIV. Okay. Virus vaccinations are very difficult. The other thing that we're often concerned with when it comes to emergent diseases is the emergent diseases that can move by air. Either through the air, like a cold virus can move from one individual to the next through air particles, or moving from one region to the next via an infected individual or an infected material from that individual. And so that's how things like Ebola made it to the United States. It was an individual that was in Africa came back and brought Ebola with them. Okay, so air travel in a couple ways. Emergent diseases, we have to know how they're moving. How do they get there? What kind of disease is it? But then even if it's, something, that is like the Zika virus, where we know that it's sexually transmitted in the Zika virus. It's transferred via mosquitoes, but it causes sexual reproductive development issues. So even though we know that's the case, we still have individuals that might have something like a Zika virus who might move or fly to a new region, get bit by a mosquito, potentially, if that mosquito is around, the same species or a similar species that can move that. So when we come with emergent diseases like the Zika virus and Ebola and bird flu, we're interested in how are they transmitted, how do people get to different regions with this disorder or disease, and then can it be transmitted when they get there? For some things, for a case like malaria, if you get malaria from Africa and you come to the United States, it's highly unlikely that if you get bit by a mosquito in the United States, that mosquito can then bite someone else and give them malaria. It's a very species-specific mosquito that can carry malaria. And so some of these emergent diseases, that's exactly what's going on. Okay? So they have very specific hosts, but in other cases, we don't know the host maybe, and that's a big concern. So when we talk about environmental health, we need to talk about the connections between sociology, psychology, medicine, but also conservation biology. In the case of, potentially getting rid of mosquitoes that carry malaria in Africa, you have to think about the one method in which you make it so all females are sterile. Then your population of mosquitoes is massively reduced. Now, you might say, well, good. What good is a mosquito? Well, mosquitoes are food for a lot of animals. A huge amount of animals feed on mosquitoes. And when we're talking about millions upon millions of mosquitoes, and you're drastically going to cut that down. And in that case, ultimately, you're going to cut all that species of the mosquito out, because that's the ultimate goal, is to rid that region of that mosquito. Now you've basically caused a mosquito to go extinct. And so you've extinct one species to benefit another. So we need to talk about conservation and what role it plays in medicine, healthcare. Sometimes this conversation goes to animal epidemics. So things that are passed from animal organisms things that are passed from animals to other animals. And in cases of humans, it's normally passed from maybe pets or livestock, some domesticated animal to the human. This is how smallpox got started and other things. Lots of other diseases, ecological diseases that have occurred. The other thing that we need to look at is the epidemics within wild animals. So what's going on with wild animals? For example, most of you probably heard of white nose syndrome in bats. It's a fungus that is decimating bat populations, and less bats, more insects. Okay. California sea lions have herpes. Okay. So they have a herpes 1 virus that they got from human sewage. So the ability for humans to pass it back the other way is also possible. Other things that maybe we don't really know what's going on. So we have a lot of situations where trees are dying all over the world. We know some places like California, the oaks and the redwoods and Douglas fir trees are getting killed by an imported fungus. We know places like Wyoming and Montana and Idaho are being decimated by pine bark beetle, Colorado, pine bark beetle, but other places that are getting hit by things that we really don't have any clue what's causing it. For example, in Colorado and Wyoming, in parts of Wyoming, there is a disease that we have deemed MAD, or massive alpine disease. And it's killing the alpines, but we don't know what it is. We don't know if it's a fungus. We don't know if it's a virus. We don't know what's killing all the aspen, but researchers are on it trying to figure this out. There's other things that affect humans from maybe a perspective of economics. When we have huge breakouts of Dermio, which is a parasite of oysters, it really rapidly changes the oyster farming capabilities, the overall economics from oysters, and then it's decimating populations. On top of that, if we still allow for people to, take oysters, then you got a combination of not only do you have these huge disease outbreaks, which is decimating populations, but now you still got the same take. And a lot of people, that make their livelihood off of, whether that's farming oysters or, farming in general, wheat and corn and things like that. There have been outbreaks in those industries, or, fishing industries and things like that. If you make your living off of farming, whether that be, farming organisms or farming plants, and you have a disease outbreak, I mean, most people know you can go to a farmer and say, hey, I need you to not, you can take half of what you could last year. How many farmers, how many ranchers, how many, fishermen are going to be like, okay, sounds great? Hardly anyone. So you got to balance that ecology. That ecology is going to play a role now. Now you got this disease that's taking out a certain amount of the population. You can't have humans taking the rest of the population. Otherwise you'll drive things to extinction really fast. So the other thing is we sometimes need to look at what we call conservation medicine. And that is, as the environment changes, which we know it is changing, it's warming, tropical storms are moving, the amount of water in certain regions is becoming deviated, the glaciers on many of our mountains are decreasing extremely fast. We also need to look at how that affects some of these ecological diseases. We know in some things like, dermio, that as it warms, that disease gets to spread up the coast further. White nose syndrome in bats is probably the same thing. We know it's true for alpine bark beetles, for pine bark beetles, is that when you have warm temperatures and the winters are not cold enough to kill off those individuals, then more individuals in the spring have more babies and you have bigger outbreaks. And so we need to think about how ecology, how the environment predicts the disease. Another big one that I want to point out is, you heard at the the end of the video last time when we were listening to or watching the video on CRISPR-Cas9, and you have industries and individuals against GMOs, genetically modified organisms, or using gene drives, or using genetics to fight diseases and things like that, that we have other ways, other natural ways to control for this. Well, no, we don't in many cases. For example, pesticide resistance. Even if we use natural pesticides, organisms can become resistant. Many of the mosquitoes that carry malaria are resistant to almost every single pesticide that we have. So you can say, well, all right, we'll just net. We'll net every bed. Okay, well, that's possible, but are you going to net the outside when the kid walks outside and goes to school? Are you going to net, when they're harvesting the field? How are you going to get around this? Okay, so there are situations where, due to pesticide resistance, due to livelihood of the individuals, it's not possible to prevent malaria in these communities. We've tried. And we've been spraying pesticides in some of these communities for a long time, 10, 15, 20 years. And now the mosquitoes, you get 75, 80% resistance to the pesticide. You're not doing anything except for wasting funds, wasting money. So pesticide resistance can be a huge problem. And so the other thing that we can get is not just the host, not just the mosquito. We now see malaria that used to be destroyed by anti-malarial drugs is not. It's resistant now. So that protozoan has now become resistant to our drugs. And we have roughly, I think in the past we've had like 10 to 15 different anti-malarial drugs, and maybe right now only 2 of them work. The rest of them, there's complete resistance against it. And so a lot of times we cause this issue because we don't think about the evolution of the organism that we're trying to control. You're trying to control the protozoan malaria. And so you're destroying it with anti-malarial drugs. Well, all it takes is a few parasites to live, to be resistant, and through their genes, now you have more parasites and more and more. And if you're never changing the anti-malarial drug, pretty soon it's 100% resistance. And that's exactly what's going on with malaria. And so it just goes back to what we were talking about a long time ago when we were talking about natural selection, evolution. Every single organism on the planet is controlled by natural laws. And humans are trying, in many cases, to make living on this planet habitable and enjoyable and profitable in many cases. But what ultimately happens is actions that we do using herbicides, using pesticides, using insecticides, all these actions just propagate the problem for later generations. I mean, the use of insecticides to destroy populations of mosquitoes, or mosquitoes in regions like in Wyoming. Sometimes they'll come by and they'll spray, pesticides to get rid of the mosquitoes. Eventually, there will be mosquitoes that are resistant to that pesticide, that insecticide. So what does that mean? You either change your insecticide or you keep wasting your money. Because eventually, every single insect, every single mosquito will be resistant to that. And on and on and on and on. We battle this. It's called an evolutionary arms race. We battle this with bacteria. We battle this with viruses. We battle this with protozoans and insects and weeds in our fields all the time. But we don't battle it, in my opinion, the right way. Because we allow things to develop resistance. And we overuse pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, antibacterial properties, and we can really cause super bugs in both situations, okay, like super bacteria, super viruses, super insects, super weeds, and cause even more of a problem by having poor management processes because we don't understand ecology. So antibacterial resistance or antibiotic resistance happens all the time, and it can go either way. You can, you have drugs that are preventing the growth of bacteria. If you use them too much, either from antibiotics, so pill form or liquid form, or you wipe your counters down with the same substance too much, eventually what happens is that bacteria will develop some resistance to it. And so we have lots of situations where this is the case. MRSA, which is a strain of bacteria that is antibiotic resistance, is now all over the place. It probably started off in China and maybe the US. It's kind of, the information is a little bit difficult to decide where it started, but it killed lots of individuals, and now it's all over the world. And so, and why? Because we used the same antibiotics over and over and over again. They became resistant, and they became more virulent. Virulent meaning disease or death causing, and that's often the case. Now, sometimes it's the individual's fault. Right? The individual is taking the drug because they will not finish the entire course of the drug. But other cases, it's how the drug is administered or how much of the drug is brought in. Okay? So if you look at this, okay, there is about 100 million antibiotic doses prescribed in the United States every year. So 100 prescriptions for some antibiotic, different antibiotics, clearly. 50 million of them are wrong. 50 million of them are either unnecessary. So you go to the doctor and you can test this out. I highly suggest not taking the antibiotic. Go to the doctor, tell the doctor that you have a terrible cough, you've had it for a long time, okay, you're hacking up phlegm, you feel awful, okay, and what will they do? They'll prescribe you an antibiotic. 99% of them will give you an antibiotic. 99% of the time, though, if you actually have those symptoms, it's not a bacterial infection, it's a virus infection. And antibiotics do not work against viruses. It's unnecessary for you to take that. You'll take it. Maybe you'll start feeling better because it's either ran its course or because it has the placebo effect and you think you're taking medicine and you feel better. Or sometimes they give you the wrong drug. Right? So maybe you have a bacterial infection, you need antibiotics, but they give you the wrong drug, a drug that has already shown or has already had antibiotic resistance developed for it. The other thing that we have an issue with is, and I don't know where this came from, is doping animals. We've been doping farm animals, beef, chicken, pigs, you name it, for a long time. We've been doping them with antibiotics, and it's not just to protect them from bacterial infections. But we know that if you dope them, you can help maintain or lessen the energetics of their immune system so they can expend more energy to put on fat. And through doing this, yes, there could be some residue in the animal itself, but that's not what most of the issues are. Most of the issues come in the urine and fecal material that is excreted out, which creates antibiotic resistance inside our water systems. So here's just kind of a preview of how antibiotic resistance works. You get a mutation in just one individual. The rest die. Now that mutated individual, these guys are asexual. They just bud. They just make new versions of themselves. Now it's completely antibiotic resistant. Okay? And so the other way that this can happen is you can have passing of genetic material between two bacteria, unrelated bacteria in many cases. It's called conjugation, and they can pass genes or genetics between each other and cause an entire resistant colony that was not even the same species of bacteria that you were interested in getting rid of with that antibiotic. All right, next time we will talk about toxicology. What happens when we get high levels of chemicals in water, food, things like that? How do we detect it? What does it do to our body? And other issues with the environment.